Anyway, moving on to the boxing now. Andy Ruiz versus Chris Arreola. What did you think of that fight?
So every time you say Chris Arreola, I'm like, because I just find the Ariola a funny name. Look, I expected Andy Ruiz to. He looked very different physically. I think he dropped about 30 pounds.
Which good for him, you know.
Which is good for him. He obviously looked a lot leaner and a little bit smaller,
A
right?
little bit more. He even looks a little bit quicker as well.
Looked a little bit more agile. If you lose a little bit of weight, obviously the speed is going to increase, and if speed increases, power will increase as well. I understand that people weren't too sure by the scorecards. I think it was a lot more closely. I think the rounds were a little bit closer than the judges put out there, right? I think it was a bit silly, the amount of rounds that they scored towards Andy Ruiz Jr. However, I thought he did very well to bounce back. Well, he took the first round, obviously, but the second and third was when Ariola dropped him. And dropped him in the third round, but I believe he was kind of rocked in that second round. He looked vulnerable. He definitely looked vulnerable. And but then fourth round onwards, it was a much more closely contested fight. And I think Andy Ruiz did win. I don't think it was as closely... I'm sorry, I believe it was more closely matched than the scorecards led out to be. And I think boxing can just be like that sometimes.
Well, I liked it because it was a very, very evenly matched fight. They had very, very similar styles because they're both Mexican boxers. And the way they were both very similar in height as well and reach. So I understand where the frustration is coming from. And Chris Arreola in the post-fight interview even said that the judges can suck his dick because he actually believes that he fairly won the fight. And if I went back and I watched it again, I thought, okay, I see where the argument's coming from because they don't really, let's say if you rock somebody in a fight, they sort of score it as a significant punch. It's not really scored as a knockdown because a knockdown's only scored if, they had a free point of contact. So that's really why I reckon where the argument's coming from. So then again, you've got to judge the effectiveness for these punches. Like, if he gets hit and he stumbles back, does that punch have
any more significance than the other ones? I get it.
So that's where the arguments come through. But Andy Ruiz, he had a game plan though, and he stuck to it, and I think that was really well. He was using the middle of the cage really, really well, and there was a lot more movement than if you compared to the fight he had against Anthony Joshua. His movement was just so much better than that Anthony Joshua fight, and I can tell him losing the weight was so much more better for him. And not even that, but his output was a lot higher and his efficiency was a lot higher. But again, it was just a close to even match. But the thing is, for Andy Ruiz, because he needs to come back from his loss to Anthony Joshua, where he had everything and then he kind of lost it, and then got rid of his trainer and all that. So there's a big switch up. I feel like Andy Ruiz needs to have a rematch with Chris before he can move on to something bigger. And then last but not least, I've got to give hats off to both of those men because that was a really, really enjoyable boxing fight to watch.
Yeah.
And I like that kind of Mexican style fighting where it's a high volume and high output.
Trying to give the crowd as much as they can.
Yeah.
I know that Ruiz after had said, look, I'm open for a rematch. And I think he's trying to do right by a fellow Mexican warrior like Chris Arreola. I know a lot of people have also said that they're considering the thought of maybe an Andy Ruiz Jr. versus Deontay Wilder. And that would be an amazing fight. I think that is what was the image if he could just steamroll through Ariola, but it wasn't that easy. It was a difficult fight. So I think Ruiz is looking for more ring time, and that means he's very much open to getting the rematch and just doing justice by a fellow Mexican as well. But I could definitely see him having a rematch with Ariola and then afterwards fighting Deontay Wilder.
Yeah, I can definitely see. Because Deontay Wilder hasn't fought